Hey everyone, this is Dawu with AutoMarketplace. Thanks a lot for joining us. We're going to do an update. The TLC does a utilization rate, monthly utilization rate, and we'll explain what all that means if you're not familiar with it. And so we're actually going to do a video that coincides with this month's update because we're going to make some predictions. And with the end of the year and so many things coming in the new year, we think this might be helpful to people to understand, maybe in a simple way, what the data means or what the data implies or what at least we think it implies and some predictions we have. So let's get right into it. So for those who don't follow us, basically what we do, we have a newsletter. We kind of draft up an article and then we embed the video that you're watching right now in the article. And then we'll go over some links. And so I always try to do my best to keep it as short as possible. Definitely, under an hour or less than an hour. But we are more of like a long form in the weeds type of publication. But there's also going to be a table of contents so you can skip around if that's helpful. So, okay. The title of this article is 2024 Lockout UR utilization rate as UR set to finish above 53%. Yellow cabs break 15% market share. Uber/Lyft golden ticket era begins. Okay, so then kind of the byline header is increasing probability that lockout influence utilization will finish above 53% floor. Taxis break 15% market share, and why we think having access to Uber/Lyft in NYC in New York City will be seen as a quote unquote golden ticket. Okay, so here are the bullet points. Industry-wide utilization rate, often abbreviated as UR, is a key metric used in NYC's driver minimum pay calculation for high volume bases, which are only currently Uber and Lyft. A high volume base, just so you know, we'll get into this, but a high volume base is basically any dispatching base that does more than 10,000 trips daily, and Uber and Lyft are the only bases that are even close to that. So they're the only high volume bases, just in case you don't know that terminology. Bullet point 2, UR is how busy a driver is kept while logged into either Uber or Lyft and NYC. Basically, that's what it means. So, for example, while you're logged into Uber and Lyft NYC, if you're busy 53% of the time, the utilization rate is 53%, just to be simplistic. October industry-wide UR, so obviously we're in December, but TLC publishes kind of with a 2-month lag for the UR, was 53.3%. Year-to-date UR 53.4%. We'll get into what that all means. Yellow cab trips continue to grow at a healthy pace, plus 9.2% year on year in November. Uber and Lyft trips increased after plus 3.7% year on year after 2-month decline. So we actually have So just to not confuse people, the UR data and industry-wide data is for October, but we do have trip data for November, excluding other FHV sectors. So we'll clarify, but the UR data is as of October, but the trip data is as of November. Okay, last 2 bullet points. Taxi medallion trips claimed over 15% market share, first time since October 2022. 3,900 medallions in storage implies future yellow cab share gains. Last bullet point. We believe having access to Uber/Lyft and NYC will be seen as a quote unquote golden ticket. I'm referring to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, if you know that story. So welcome to our monthly update. So we do a monthly update on UR. So this was our last monthly update, November 20th. Today is December 19th. So in November was a September UR update, if you will. UR can simply be described as how busy an NYC TLC licensed driver who works for Uber and Lyft is kept while they are logged into the apps. As a reminder, industry-wide UR is measured on a calendar year, January-December basis, so there might be some months that can drag the average lower, but are offset by other months that are busier. The lower the UR is, especially anything that risks breaking the 53%. I'm gonna explain this very briefly after I read these sentences. The lower the UR is, especially anything that risks breaking the 53% driver minimum pay related UR flow, the higher probability of lockouts. And that's a link to our YouTube video we did on that, or ability for active Uber/Lyft drivers to access the apps when and where they want. In addition, the lower the UR, the longer newly registered drivers will have to wait to get access to Uber and Lyft and NYC. As we recently reported, Uber has an over 15,000 plus driver waitlist to work in the 5 boroughs. Directly access the TLC fact book. Click here. Okay, that's very heavy. We're going to provide the links to all of this. So that's the link November 11th to when I refer to that driver waitlist. Okay. So let me simplify those 3 things. So utilization rate is a key metric used to measure the minimum driver pay. So for example, if an Uber Lyft driver earns $50, the TLC will say, well, if an Uber Lyft driver earns $50 in an hour, right? What the TLC, let me rephrase that. So let's say the TLC is solving for $30 an hour as the minimum pay. Obviously, if an Uber driver isn't working and they're just kind of sitting, a TLC driver is just sitting, they don't. Logic dictates that they just can't earn $30, sitting idle. So what what the TLC in New York City did, I'm explaining this not ideally. Basically, what the TLC did is they're saying if we just made a minimum wage of saying Uber needs to pay $30, what Uber will say is, okay, we'll keep you busy for 10 minutes every hour and we'll pay you $30 an hour for those 10 minutes. The TLC or in New York City, their intention was, well, they're going to game that system because they'll have all these drivers. And for the 20 minutes those drivers are busy in an hour, they'll pay them $30 an hour or $40 an hour. But for the other 40 minutes, there's no compensation, although they're willing to take a trip. So what the TLC and City came up with, nobly, I understand the concept, is they're saying, well, we'll apply a utilization rate. So if let's say they're solving for $30 an hour, what they're saying is that during an hour, if you include idle time and everything, a driver should be making $30 gross. And so that's what that UR multiplier is trying to solve for. It's basically trying to avoid is trying to make a true minimum wage, like similar to a W-2 versus an independent contractor wage. So that's what it's solving. Right? I'm not sure if I explained that in the best way possible. If not, leave comments. I can clarify in comments. But basically, the UR is saying that you have to keep a driver busy enough to ensure that they're actually making a minimum wage. So in conclusion, if Uber keeps you busy 10 minutes of an hour, and during that 10 minutes, they pay you $40 an hour, for the whole hour, you're clearly not making a minimum wage. You're making $40 for the 10 minutes. So the utilization rate is a mechanism to ensure that idle time and time available for a trip is being calculated in a driver wage. So the metric they use is 53% of the time, and that's basically the TLC wants Uber and Lyft to keep their drivers, or any other high volume base, but it's only Uber and Lyft, want to keep their drivers at minimum busy 53% of the time, either driving to a passenger or with a passenger. So that's what the UR is about. And 53% is the benchmark. Okay. So let's get into Uber and Lyft October 2024 data. So Uber standalone UR fell from 54.9% in September to 53% in October. Its standalone year-to-date UR fell from 51% to September to 54.8%. So just, excuse me, just to be simplistic about this, the regulatory floor is 53%. So these numbers are super close to that regulatory floor. If they dip below the 53%, there's this kind of complex formula, but just the only thing you need to know is that if they dip below 53%, then Uber's going to have the minimum wage that Uber has to pay drivers is going to go up. We can get into super technicalities about this, but basically Uber and Lyft have to stay above 53%, or there's other major financial implications for them. So Lyft standalone UR with lockouts, driver access restrictions, remains elevated, but declined from 55.9% in September to 54.4% in October. Its year-to-date UR to October now stands at 49.3%. Lyft's NYC trip market share relative to Uber increased slightly to 24.4% in October 2024 versus 23.9%. For additional context, in 2023, Lyft's relative NYC market share was 28.1% to Uber's 71.9%. So Lyft's market share is going down. And we've talked about that in the past related to these UR rules. We're not going to go too deep into that because we've spoken about it, and you can refer to our other videos. We'll provide links to that. But basically Lyft is kind of bleeding market share, and it does relate to UR in our opinion. So where are we finding all of this data? So basically, this is how the TLC factbook looks. All sorts of data you can. So the November trip data, 1 of 7 pages. Then there's this data on driver data, where people, very cool data, honestly, where people, the language, the origin, age group. See, this is as of October 2024, although the trip data is of November. Then you have this licensed vehicle data, including medallions and storage, EVs, waves, different things like that, active medallions as of November. Then you have this driver pay, which is, they just released that. We did an article on that. It's not going to be the focus of this, but we've done an article on that and we'll discuss it later on. Then here's the thing. Here's the utilization rate data. So, this is where I'm getting these figures from. This is the market share data. That's that. This is the Green Rides initiative. We usually go over, we're going to skip going over this because they're well ahead of the Green Rides initiative, meaning by 2030, 100% of all TLC cars, New York City for hire vehicles should be either Wave or EVs. Sorry, 100% of Uber and Lyft high volume trips should be done in an EV or Wave. TLC is well ahead of schedule because they released a lot of EV plates. So this is not, it's interesting and it's very cool, but it's something that's not going to be the focus because they're well ahead of schedule. Okay. That's where this data is coming from. Okay, so I kind of spell out what this 53% UR regulatory floor is. While we still have to wait for November and December UR data, it increasingly appears industry-wide UR will clear the 53% regulatory threshold required by the TLC. Obviously, has been well documented, this UR has been inflated due to Uber and Lyft's use of lockouts, which began just before the summer. And this is what this whole lockout thing and why they're locking out, it fundamentally relates to the utilization rate. So if you lock out a driver, if they go offline, then think about that. Then Uber and Lyft, they're not on the clock, if you will. A driver's not on the clock, so they can elevate the utilization of a driver if that driver's not on the clock. That's the genesis of lockouts, very simplistically. If that's simplistic. If not, again, leave comments and everything. I can try to, we've gone over this before in other videos. So, but if you want to refer to those videos, I have the extensive explanation. But just think about it like a punch clock. Like basically, if you can punch out a driver, you can increase how busy they are when they're on the app, basically. So in September, so this is what all this UR and lockouts and driver pay thing relates to. So Brad Lander, who's running for for the mayor, I'm sure he's currently the city comptroller, had a press conference with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, and he says, this kind of gets to the gist of what I'm talking about, the 53%. This is quote, there are serious concerns that Uber and Lyft may be using driver lockouts to artificially inflate utilization rates ahead of the 2024 average utilization rate review, again from January, December, which would impact their compliance with the city's minimum pay requirements for drivers. If true, this practice could have significant implications for the livelihoods of drivers who rely on these platforms to support their families. Basically, and we've done an article on this too. This was in October. Comptroller, NYC mayoral candidate Lander stands with Nitro on knockouts, but it's more complicated, and we get into that. We'll provide a link to everything. But basically, what Lander and driver and the New York Taxi Workers Alliance specifically are saying is that lockouts are being used to kind of game the and Bloomberg extensively reported on this as well, done really good reporting on it. That Uber and Lyft are using lockouts to game the UR, how busy they are keeping drivers who are available to drive. So simply, if you can force log out a driver, it's like punching someone out mid-shift. And then that increases, it can have the effect of increasing the reported utilization rate. So let's say a driver is there for an hour, you keep that driver busy for 20 minutes, and then boom, you lock them out mid-shift, then you get them back online 15 minutes later, the UR will be elevated because that kind of idle time when a driver is ready to take a trip is not being counted. So basically, that's what this whole lockout thing is about and the controversy around it. Now, Lyft and Uber will say, there are other implications of that. Of even New York City is the only place that uses a UR. So there's a, I'm sorry, I'm going like in and out. Sorry about that. There's a minimum per mile and per mile and per minute rate. But what makes New York City different is they layer on a utilization rate. And just to be clear, it's that same concept that if an Uber and Lyft driver, let's say they're available to take a trip for 10 hours in a day, but Uber, they're kept busy for 7 hours, and during those 7 hours they make uh, $30 an hour. If there's 3 hours effectively where and Uber and Lyft are paying them, $30 an hour for those trips. If for 3 hours they're not earning any money, the actual wage they're earning blended is obviously less than $30 per hour, if that makes sense. So what the utilization rate tried to do was say that no, you have to keep the drivers busy to ensure that they're actually earning something that looks like a living wage. Good intentions, but we'll briefly get into why that has other implications, why it's not ideal. So two separate things. There's per mile and per minute minimum rates, which other jurisdictions have. New York City, including New York City, the thing that makes New York City different is they have this utilization rate. Okay, we'll get back to this point, but you get the gist. So these are the UR figures. And so the main point of mentioning these figures is that Uber and Lyft have to go above 53%. They're at 53.4% year to date. There's only 2 months left. So it looks like they're going to clear that threshold. But then, there's an argument that, well, that's manipulated UR, and, let's see how that goes. And the TLC is also proposing new rules. But if they use that data, then it looks like they're going to clear the threshold. Okay, let's get into trips and then revert back to the UR and how that impacts what we're talking about, golden ticket and yellow cabs and all of this stuff. Okay. Uber and Lyft trips grow again. We analyze overall for higher trip demand in NYC. In November, Uber and Lyft, high volume, NYC trip data diverged from recent year-on-year trends, with overall trips growing 3.7%. In August and September, high volume app trips registered declines for the first time since the post-pandemic recovery. So we've been covering this. So this is Uber and Lyft monthly trip growth. Again, this is getting from the fact book and our analysis. So it actually declined in August and September. And then in November, it actually increased 3.7%. So that's kind of off trend, which is encouraging. Based on November industry data, Uber and Lyft originated close to 600. This is how big the New York City market is. People don't appreciate this. They originated close to 666,200 daily average trips. Based on October data, across all sectors, Uber and Lyft's market share of all legal NYC for hire transportation trips was 79.0%. And that's the trip trend. You can see the post-pandemic period. So here we make the point. So in October 2023, when there were no lockouts, there were 20.2 million overall Uber and Lyft trips in that month. And the industry-wide UR was 55.2% without lockouts. So remember, we're saying that lockouts have the impact of increasing UR, manipulating. I don't even think Uber and Lyft disagrees with that. They're obviously gaming the system. Technically, I don't think they're breaking any legal rules, obviously subject to lawsuits and whatnot. But our point here is in October, there was this many trips and the utilization rate was well above, 2.2% above that. The industry-wide UR was well above the 53% threshold without lockouts. In October 2024, there were slightly less trips in October, but the industry UR was 53.3%, just barely above the 53% threshold with lockouts. So without lockouts, you had 50 in October 2023, you had 55% plus UR, industry-wide UR. With lockouts in about the same amount of trips, you barely are breaking the 53% threshold. So there's clearly, that implies that there's oversaturation, meaning that there's probably too many drivers and their associated for-hire vehicles for a limited amount of trips. And that can be seen also trip growth is obviously since that period, there's a declining trend. Now this was, grew month on month in November, but it's still, there were much higher growth rates, to be fair, on, it's post-pandemic. So that's why the growth rates were higher, but still the growth rate is kind of plateauing, you could say, plateauing to decreasing. And just so for the backup for the UR, what we're talking about, if you go to the fact book, so you can see September industry-wide UR. Look at this. So industry-wide UR is 55.2. Lyft UR was 4. This is without lockouts. 47.6%, 58.8%. Huge UR from Uber, well above 53%. That's October 2023 without lockouts. Now you go to October 2024 with at least Lyft lockouts. I think Uber eased up on lockouts now, but Lyft has harsh lockouts. Industry-wide UR is down. Uber UR is down. And Lyft UR, because of lockouts, has been manipulated higher, actually. That's what makes it maybe complex to realize. But just think about Uber, 58.8% UR. They were able to keep their drivers really busy last October. Obviously, as many of you know, late October, November, that's when they allowed the release of almost 10,000 new TLC plates related to the reinstatement of the EV exemption to the TLC plate cap. And, surprise, surprise, they released all those plates and look what happened to UR. But anyways, topic for another time. 58.8%, 53.3%, industry-wide UR 53.3%, 55.2%. And again, this is without lockouts. This is with lockouts. So even with lockouts, they're just barely making it work. So that's the point there. So in previous updates, we haven't talked about the traditional black car, livery, and luxury basis. So I wanted to touch on this. So FHV other, so going back to the back book. Oh, skipped around. Okay. So there's like these 4 sectors. High volume is Uber and Lyft. FHV other is like traditional black car, livery, Lux limo. Green cab, which has been, we'll get into, street hail livery, has really been kind of demolished since the pandemic, but that's another sector. And then yellow taxi. So those are the 4 sectors. So FHV other reported trip data, which represents dispatches originating from traditional black car, livery, and luxury bases, lags by 1 month. This is why we can't do it nice and clean on November. We have to industry-wide. It has to be October because the November data for FHV other is not published. But so FHV other reported trip data, which represents dispatches originating from traditional black car, livery, and luxury bases, lags by 1 month versus other sectors. Traditional black car, livery, and luxury bases, often called Lux limo bases, which need $1 million plus insurance, still account for between 6 to 7% of total NYC TLC trips. So still like a good chunk, 6 to 7%. Although FHV other trips decreased 23.7% year on year in October, this sector's trips increased 34.7% year on year in September. Obviously smaller numbers, but huge gains and losses. Since FHV other trip data lags by 1 month and accounts for a smaller share of the overall market, we're not confident in drawing a correlation between increased Uber and Lyft trips and declining FHV other trips. In simple terms, we're not sure if Uber and Lyft's November trip growth is explained by the apps taking share from traditional bases without understanding the sector's trip data from November. Our point is, we're saying that, Uber kind of broke trend in November. So is that like the overall market growth? What you'll see later on, we've done a total trip analysis, and on a total trip basis, trips actually decline slightly. So is it kind of like a zero sum game that Uber kind of took share away from traditional, black car and livery bases, and that's how they drew gains versus like the overall market gaining? Now, we can't really draw that conclusion because we'd be comparing October to November data. And in fact, in October, when trips declined, it's kind of tricky to make conclusions because based on our analysis, if you kind of do this analysis for FHV other, just to tell you how we're doing this, you see like September, there's 1.7 million FHV other trips in 2024. And then versus September 2023, there was 1.3 million. So 1.7 million to 1.3 million, that's a huge gain. But then in October, you have 1.4 million, but in October 2023, there was 1.9 million, 1.86 million. So it's, this very volatile gain. So we just want to mention that, we want to give people insight into that sector. Green cabs or street hail livery now only represent 0.2% of total overall trips. SHL trips have declined. Green cab taxi trips have declined 16.1% year on year in 2024, year to date November. I mean, this is just a really sad story. So, I mean, I think just the numbers speak for themselves. Like this industry is just, it's way below what it was pre-pandemic, and so that also could be growing. That trip loss could maybe be flowing to Uber and Lyft or FHV other, but it's such a small part of the industry now that, we'll include in an overall industry sector analysis, but it's down and it's much smaller than it used to be. Okay. Yellow cabs break 15% market share. So there's 3,931 taxi medallions remain in storage. This is down from 3,973 taxi medallions in last month's fact book, i.e., so there's 42 medallions no longer in storage. And if we look back to our last, and we'll provide the links to all of this, this is our last fact book update. Back then, when we analyzed it, there was it said although 3,973 taxi medallions remain in storage, this is down from 4,158 medallion in last month's fact book. So obviously, as you can tell, more and more medallions are coming out of storage. That's a good trend. For the over 9,500 active NYC yellow cabs, just so you guys know, there's 13,587 authorized ever issued taxi medallions. That's how you bridge roughly from 9,500 plus active cabs to the storage. Industry trips continue to surge. So more trips for yellow cabs are occurring, although like trips per taxi might not be increasing as much. Overall industry trips are increasing. Taxi medallion trips, including those dispatched via Uber, Curb, or Arrow, these are the Uber technically dispatches them via, like they dispatch them on the consumer side, but it actually is technically done via Curb, we believe. So taxi medallion trips, including those dispatched by Uber, Curb, or Arrow, increased 9.2% year on year. Yellow cabs are now performing 121,500 trips per day. So, this is like a story that's happening, very healthy growth rates here. Obviously, more taxis are coming online. So then based on October data, so across all sectors, yellow cab market share of all legal NYC for hire transportation trips was 15.1%. This was the first time since October 2022, a month that also had 1.1 million fewer overall trips than October 2024. The taxi medallion sector has claimed a more than 50%, claim more than 50% of total NYC trip share. So we've done this analysis since January 2022. These are the market shares, kind of just on the edge of the post-pandemic recovery in January 2022, if you want to say. And then in September 2023, the market share dropped for yellow cabs all the way below 12%. And now it's recovered to 15.1%. And yes, back here, it was in October 2022 is also above 15%, but it was like 1.1 million less trips. So this is more of a recovery. And so this is how the market looks like. It's relative, almost 80, 15. You get to 95. I think this equals 99.9% because there's rounding errors. But this is the whole market basically. So FHV other sectors is kind of between this. I think the median is 6.5%, but it hovers between 5 to 7% kind of thing. So that level sets us, and now we're getting to the predictions, and this comes to the end of our article, and which this part might be more interesting, but this is the data that backs our predictions. Okay. Uber/Lyft will likely lose market share. Yellow cab set to benefit, and app golden ticket era begins. Okay, what does all of that mean? Okay, so just follow along. Combining more yellow cabs becoming active. So you saw that the tax medallion storage is going down. And if you look at the fact book, this fact book is, if we do yellow cabs, you can see that obviously just collapsed in the pandemic, but we're approaching, I don't know, this doesn't cleanly bridge to 13,587, but we're approaching 10,000 active yellow cabs, yellow taxis, according to the TLC fact book. So, more and more cabs are coming online, more and more medallions and storage are coming off, or decreasing. Medallion storage are decreasing, which coincides with this increase. So, okay, so that's clear. So combining, one, more yellow cabs becoming active, two, over 3,900 taxi medallions needing to be roaded. So you still have to get those 3,900 in storage on the road. And three, overall, across all sectors, NYC for hire trip growth lower overall across all sectors. NYC for hire trip growth, we'll show you the chart on that. We believe Uber and Lyft are likely going to lose market share to the taxi medallion sector, the yellow cab sector. This, in turn, will impact the ability for Uber and Lyft to maintain higher utilization rates to keep their busier, stop lockouts, and onboard new drivers. We know, we're going to explain this if you're not following along. We know TLC, the regulators, working on new rules to prevent future lockouts, but we are concerned about the regulators and broader media, quote unquote, experts' ability to analyze the situation from a first principles basis. And we don't mean to mock the regulator or media or experts, but obviously, like, this market has been in chaos. And the reason we make these videos is not to mock them, but we hope that they're listening, because a lot of our predictions, you know, have come true. We warned about lockouts back in October 2023, even before then. And so, I used to work in the finance industry and, analyze, you're in the prediction game in that industry. So there's one thing to say that, okay, if someone's made a prediction and nothing comes true, then okay, sorry, let me increase it. There's one thing if we've been operating in this industry as a fleet owner, as a media enterprise, as a content producer, for long enough that we have a track record of making predictions, and not every single one comes true, but many of them are coming true. And the point of us saying that is not to say, oh, look how smart we are. That's not the point at all. We're trying to get the regulators and media's attention to say, there's more to this than kind of some clickbait headlines that are not actually understanding the first principles of why lockouts are occurring. And I'm not saying that it's not due to people not willing to do that. It's just there's a lot of technicalities with this industry. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the regulator doesn't understand what's going on, but sometimes uh, based on policy, it's still not quite clear to me if they're getting the full picture. So again, we're going to predict this not to mock or make fun or anything like that. We're just simply trying to educate the marketplace, and hopefully the regulator will see our content, or other policymakers will see our contents, which has happened in the past, and that might influence how policymakers approach this. So in any case, that's our little kind of why this content exists, or why we're outlining our predictions. We also want to see a strong industry and marketplace. So anyways, below we try to summarize how we are reaching the above conclusion. So okay, I said all of that, and maybe it's not clear, like, how am I reaching that conclusion? We also include a video speaking to our points, the one I'm doing right now, at the end of the article. Okay, look at this chart. So in the above charts, we did yellow taxi growth and we did Uber and Lyft monthly growth. Now, obviously, that's 95% of the market. So that captures everything. But if you blend everything together, so on the right-hand y-axis, that's the total number of monthly trips. And on the left-hand y-axis, that's the year-on-year, because there's seasonality. So the most appropriate way to compare trip data is like November to November, September to September. It's not, you shouldn't compare it like September 24 to August 2024, because there's seasonality. So I think this chart is just, it's as almost as clear as day. Year-on-year trip growth is declining. It's decreasing a little bit. So it's plateauing. So there's a finite amount of trip growth now that defines the marketplace. That's just, the data is showing that. Now, if the data reverses that, obviously, maybe our opinions are going to be wrong. But anybody who analyzes data, I mean, this is as clear of a trend as can be seen. Like, it's the year-on-year trip growth is declining to plateauing. Okay, so let's go over these three things we said. We said combining, one, more yellow cabs becoming active, over 3,900 taxi medallions needing to be roaded, and 3, lower overall across all sectors NYC fire trip growth, we believe Uber and Lyft are likely going to lose market share to the taxi medallion sector. This in turn will impact the ability for Uber and Lyft to maintain higher utilization rates, stop lockouts, and onboard new drivers. Okay, that's that industry data referring to. Our logic. 1, Uber, Curb, and Arrow can dispatch quote unquote e-hail yellow cabs without being subject to utilization rate based TLC driver minimum pay rules. So when Uber dispatches to a yellow cab, they're not subject to that UR metric. So this directly incentivizes Uber to dispatch the taxis over other TLC regulated vehicles who are subject to those UR rules. For the basic UberX service, there's our opinion, we do not believe customers will object to receiving a yellow cab instead of a black car, as long as the price is lower and the wait time is shorter. So, number one, we're saying that if this UR thing becomes too much of a headache, and it's, as you can tell from the data, it's like right at that 53%, which is kind of nerve-wracking, I'm sure, for the apps. And also, beyond being nerve-wracking for the apps, it just fundamentally shows that like the market is oversaturated. It's hard for Uber and Lyft to keep the number of active drivers busy. So what that might end up doing is that, because there's, surges and different type of stuff, what it might end up doing, it might incentivize Uber to start dispatching to yellow cabs who are not subject to the UR rules. And then yellow cabs are structurally cheaper, which we'll get into next. Excuse me. So 2, when more of the remember, there's 3,900 yellow cabs that are in storage, medallions in storage. So imagine adding 3,900 cabs to the street, and there's the trip growth is flat. Think about what we're saying. When more of the 3,900 yellow cabs in storage are added to the city grid, or in a single shift taxi becomes a double shift taxi, so that's also another thing. So imagine a current active yellow cab is on a single shift, but then you double shift it. That's like the equivalent of adding another car. And there's a finite market trip growth. We're this statistically showing this. We believe several trends will emerge. A, consumers prefer taxis at airports. So as you get these yellow cabs and Uber and Lyft are struggling with UR, we think trends are going to emerge. Consumers prefer taxis at airports with ongoing construction and dedicated pickup locations further away from JFK and LaGuardia departure terminal exits. We believe consumers, especially tourists, might increasingly opt to take yellow cabs that are more easier to access from the curbside versus walking 5 to 15 minutes away from the terminal exit. Basically, we're saying as when you onboard these yellow cabs, where are they getting their trip? So we're kind of saying that this is where I think the trip demand is going to come from. And I think this is why yellow cab trips are also growing. So there's also how is that happening? So one explanation is the Uber Curb dispatches. We also think this is another explanation. So Ira Goldstein, who is the Black Car Chair Executive Director, Black Car Fund Executive Director, actually mentioned this in a Black Car News. He writes really interesting. He has a column called Ira's Insight on the Black Car News. We'll provide a link to everything. He actually mentioned this. And just to read from his thing, moving into other news, as I'm sure you're well aware, there's Ira Goldstein writing this. The changes to passenger pickup procedures at JFK Airport's Terminal 4 have been frustrating, to say the least. It is a major inconvenience for passengers and a serious obstacle for drivers. In late August, the Port Authority, who oversees the area's airports, gave an industry briefing and said these changes, which are initially set to expire in September, were being extended mid-October due to concerns that ongoing construction would lead to increased traffic congestion. Okay. This is the key point, and Ira makes it very nicely. Whenever someone needs to, and he's been in the industry for a long time, so it's a very specific point, but a very good point. Ira writes, whenever someone needs to be moved from the curb, it's always the black cars first. Taxis who pay less in airport access fees than black cars and private vehicles who pay nothing are allowed to continue picking up at the curb, while black cars are relegated to remote lots and parking garages. This is a prime example of government picking winners and losers. So, he even asked, will black cars be barred from picking up passengers at the curb for the rest of 2024? So that's the point there. That actually might be because, cabs, I believe in have to look at this stat again, but I think like globally 15%, roughly 15 or 20% plus of Uber trips originate or go to airports. I guess the going to airports is not going to be impacted by the, curbside departure pickups, but this is a huge chunk of trip volume in New York City, undoubtedly. So as you get more yellow cabs, where are they going to get the trips, and why are taxi trips increasing? And also with the the UR implications. So we think consumers are going to prefer taxis because of that dynamic. Cheaper taxi fares will shift trip demand. So this is not totally Uber and Lyft's fault. Yellow cabs can offer cheaper fares due to taximeter rates, so they're not subject to the UR based TLC driver minimum pay rules of that, roughly $30 an hour. And also with the UR, the taximeter doesn't have a UR to it, like a utilization, and structurally lower taxes and surcharges paid on yellow cab trips versus other TLC regulated vehicles. Uber and Lyft, for example, must charge and remit not 8.875% sales tax in New York. Okay. Our point here is like, again, I know this is very technical, but you got to understand why it is that yellow taxis are probably growing, and why, as more yellow taxis come online, the supply goes up. So a yellow taxi like for like can offer lower fares because they don't have like the congestion charges are, for example, a little bit less. They don't got to pay an 8.875% sales tax. Uber and Lyft don't have to. They don't have to be subject to a UR when they dispatch to yellow cab. So structurally, it might be Uber can offer yellow cabs for cheaper, and also structurally, yellow cabs, even on a street hail, can offer cheaper fares. And the driver, because especially with the street hail, if a driver gets a street hail, there's no commission to be paid per se, especially if they own the medallion. Okay, they got to pay the garage or lease if they're leasing it, but if they own the medallion outright, when they get that fare, post surcharge and everything, the a large chunk of that fare is accruing to them, while the fare is also being cheaper. Okay, I think you get that point. C, if you don't, like, leave comments in the comment section. Um, C, immediate street handhelds will be more engaged. Again, these are all our predictions, and we're trying to explain why we think this is going to continue. This yellow taxi trip growth, which is obviously far outstripping, although it's circular. So imagine if you strip out yellow cab trip growth, this is even lower, the total industry trip growth. But it's obviously breaking trend in terms of growth, and you're getting more taxis online as well. So okay, C, immediate street handhelds, on the street will be more engaged. For example, on a busy Friday night in Manhattan, if someone visibly sees more immediately available taxis on the street, they might opt to grab it versus waiting 5 to 10 minutes for a quote unquote often more expensive going to be Uber or Lyft. See, some grammar mistakes here, apologies. However, if a taxi is not visibly available, they'll likely wait for an e-hail. Okay, this is our point. And you got to combine a couple of, actually, let me make this third point and then overview what I'm saying. And we're almost done with the article. I know this might be going long, but I just want to really flesh our predictions out. So 3, yellow cab market share gains will hit Uber and Lyft UR. If the above plays out and taxis gain more NYC trip market share in a market with finite trip growth, so like zero sum, then there will be less passengers for all other FHV sectors. Combined with bullet point 1, that yellow cabs can be dispatched by Uber or e-hailed without the UR, this would imply that Uber and Lyft waitlists will not only grow longer, but they will also pursue strategies to right size their currently active NYC TLC driver base. You're already seeing this with more stringent acceptance cancellation rate expectations and suspension of airport privileges, which we think will also drive many part-timers out of the marketplace. Okay, that is a lot that I just wrote there. I'll kind of briefly explain this. So in terms of that annual, we did a recent analysis of like how much drivers are earning based on this new fact book data. That's why we're not including in this update, because we just did that. But we think, okay, this is what we're referring to. We believe there are clear signs of Uber and Lyft taking actions that result in a marketplace defined by full-time drivers. Remember, they got to keep drivers uh, busy, related to that utilization rate. For example, we can report, so if there's oversaturation, if there's too many active drivers already, like there's not enough trips for those active drivers, Uber's going to somehow, some way try to increase UR by reducing access. And you can reduce access via lockouts, but if the oversaturation is enough, you might actually try to just kind of deactivate drivers basically. So we actually think they're going to target part-timers in the first instance, or people who are not don't have high acceptance rates. So for example, we can report on the following developments that have occurred over the last several weeks in NYC. Uber suspending drivers from picking up passengers at LaGuardia and JFK airports because they're spending too much time in the holding lot. Quote, and we've seen these emails from multiple drivers. So these are direct Uber quotes. This is direct Uber text from emails they've sent. Quote, your account has been identified as spending an excessive amount of time within the airport waiting lots. Think about that. So let's say if someone's logged in to the airport waiting lot and they don't get a trip for an hour, if they're online, Uber technically would have to pay them like the minimum wage, if that makes sense. Like for being idle. That's what the UR does. Um, Bullet point 2, Uber updating how acceptance and cancellation rates are calculated. Quote, your acceptance rate and cancellation rate look back window will update from your last 200 trip requests to your last 100 trip requests received. So Uber is saying that, okay, think about it from their perspective. Think about this. Let's say you want to game the system as a driver. And you're saying, okay, Uber can't lock me out. Let's say some law is passed where Uber can't lock a driver out. A driver could basically log into Uber. And now if that driver can't get locked out, what if they just reject every single trip? But if Uber can't lock them out, they're still going to get paid. So do you see what I'm saying? So what Uber is now doing, in case that law comes, and also to increase their UR in general, is they're saying that, okay, we're going to start tracking people's acceptance and cancellation rates, not only on 200 trips, but 100 trips. So if someone cancels 15% of the time, we'll give them a warning that, you're going to lose your access. So that either will incentivize them, make them accept more trips, or not. That's the key issue with utilization using that, is you are unintentionally forcing, the intention of the UR is good, but you're unintentionally forcing drivers to be more like shift workers, because they're stripping away their flexibility of rejecting trips, because Uber and Lyft are directly incentivized to make sure acceptance and cancellation rates high, because they're not going to pay an idle driver who keeps on rejecting trip requests. Okay, last one. Uber limiting the time a driver can be online from TLC allowed 10 hours per every 24 hour to 9 hours. I mean, this is more minor. So technically a TLC driver can only work, I think it's 60 hours a week. That is true. But what Uber is doing is driving on Uber is limited to no more than 9 hours at a time and 60 hours a week. So technically that could be 10 hours. There's no reason Uber couldn't limit it to 10 hours and someone works 6 days a week, but they're doing it 9 hours. So do you see what I'm saying with that? Technically a driver could work up to 10 hours, but maybe Uber is reducing that to 9 hours to also, increase how busy drivers are kept. So what you're increasingly seeing is Uber and Lyft taking actions that will force NYC drivers to work like fixed schedule contractors versus independent contractors. TLC's UR-based pay formula and the regulator not appropriately managing for hire vehicle are primarily to blame. So we're saying that there's oversaturation, and they added all of those, going back to this. Guess when UR started to decline? Right when they added all the plates. I mean, and also to be fair, trips started to level out too. Maybe that's an economic thing, or it's a combination as well. Okay, so by the way, that article we're referencing, we'll provide a link to it. That's from November. Okay, so you might think that, okay, we're sounding like negative on Uber and Lyft, but actually we're not. So and this is how our article concludes, Uber and Lyft NYC access equals golden ticket. If you agree with how we're gaming out the future, it stands to reason that having access to Uber and Lyft and NYC, even if their total market share declines to 70% or 75%, will be very valuable. So yes, right now the market share is 79%. Yellow cabs are 15%. Okay, let's say you get the 3,900, you add 3,900 taxis, just almost by definition, that market share is going to increase. If trips are not really increasing, at zero sum. So this market share or that market share might decline, but Uber and Lyft are still going to have a huge chunk of the market. We're not predicting, we think like yellow cab market share will go up to 20, 25% or something. And Uber and Lyft are still going to have a huge market share. Okay. So even if the market share declines 70 to 75%, will be very valuable. But remember, just think about what I know. We're all I'm scatterbrained right now, but think about. I just want to reiterate what I'm saying. The industry trip growth is plateauing, declining. The total industry trip growth. So it's kind of like a zero sum. There's only so many trips, finite trip growth, only so many trips to go around. You're adding yellow cabs. So if yellow cabs are growing, they're gaining more market share. What does the data show? They're gaining more market share. Okay, now if 3,900 taxis are stored and they're coming online, they're going to gain more market share because there's finite trip growth. So they're going to take it from probably Uber and Lyft on the other bases, potentially, probably more Uber and Lyft. But having access to Uber and Lyft currently, and one more thing, I'm sorry. So if they're losing market share, there's limited industry trip growth. This is our logic on why it's going to be valuable. So one, Uber and Lyft NYC will not be onboarding new drivers for the foreseeable future, i.e. the 15,000 driver waitlist we referenced. So that's point one. Point two, as we just went over, Uber and Lyft NYC will effectively kick out many NYC part-timers, leaving more read earnings for remaining drivers, or at least sustaining their earnings if the market share is declining. Okay. Number three, having access to Uber/Lyft equals having access to the majority of NYC trips. If a driver has access to one or both of the HV, high volume app dispatching bases, Uber and Lyft, that controls 70% plus of all NYC private trips, that is very valuable, a quote unquote golden ticket. As UR stabilizes near regulatory thresholds of 53% and waiting lists become longer, we pose a few questions to our readers. If a driver has claim to their own FHV license, TLC plate, but does not have access to Uber and or Lyft and NYC, how valuable is the TLC plate? Why can't TLC drivers sell access? We're kind of going on a tangent, but we just want to pose these questions, maybe to promote discussion, maybe to lay the seeds for future discussions. Why can't TLC drivers sell access to their right to work on Uber and Lyft NYC when there's a lengthy waiting list? Can't Uber or Lyft facilitate this after conducting basic screening? How can the TLC help facilitate the creation of high volume dispatch right asset? Note, this asset will primarily benefit drivers, not leasing companies. We're going to go over all of this very briefly, and then we'll conclude. Can Uber and Lyft NYC be forced to adopt regulated franchise model NYC? So the yellow cab industry, you could view the medallion as like a franchise. When you buy a medallion, you buy like one of 13,587. You buy into the taxi franchise, the yellow cab franchise of NYC. So can Uber and Lyft NYC be forced to adopt a regulated franchise model NYC given their large duopoly trip market share? It might be analogous to how drivers used to sell their black card-based radio dispatch rights. You can actually see ads for radios in relatively recent versions of the Black Car News classified section. So if you go to June 2022, we'll open this PDF. So if you go to, where is it? Oh, wow, these should be much longer. Sorry about this. Go to the classified section. Here it is. Okay. Do you see this here? It says NYC NY1 radio voucher work and plenty of work for serious dollars. Net 1,200. Put in the hours. Best deal. Dial car. I think dial a car franchise tablet for sale. Asking $20,000. You see. So at that time, maybe in 2019 that was aggressive, but like to sell it for $20,000. Dial car franchise tablet for $20,000. What I'm saying is that what you might see, but I don't know, it's kind of like an Uber and Lyft thing, and maybe TLC should somehow create this mechanism where if what we're saying is Uber and Lyft are not going to onboard a lot of new drivers. I don't think that's a controversial statement. I think that's quite clear with the 15,000 plus driver wait list and the UR requirements. So they're not going to onboard a lot of new drivers. Then probably because it's oversaturated, a lot of active Uber and Lyft drivers probably will lose access. So that even leaves less drivers. So whoever has access to Uber and Lyft in NYC, that's like a very valuable right, basically. So that's what I'm referring to the golden ticket. And I'm just kind of seeding these ideas where it's like, okay, can you monetize this somehow? And that would benefit the driver. Then this is how I conclude the article. Taxi medallion equal gold. So like Uber and Lyft access is the golden ticket, and then is the taxi medallion gold. That's what an asset that used to be compared to. And obviously nothing we write or share is financial advice. Please read this disclaimer. We also think the yellow cab industry is set to have a comeback based on the above outline logic. So that share gain and those 3,900 coming back online. For Plus subscribers, please note that these trends, especially as it relates to our ongoing analysis of the NYC tax medallion marketplace. So we did this article. We'll provide the links to everything. We have a follow-on article about tax medallion valuations. But if you combine all of what we're saying, this is how we will conclude. This is more directed towards Uber and Lyft NYC drivers. January is going to be slow. August is slow. We all know this. When January is slow, you might think that, oh, okay, I'm going to, give up on Uber and Lyft. The only thing that's different, and take our advice for what it's worth, but we outline the logic, is if you have access to Uber and or Lyft in NYC, you really got to think like 10 times before you quit the industry, because having access to Uber and Lyft in New York City is very valuable. And I think it's going to become more and more obvious as time goes on. So I'll conclude there. I know we ran a little bit long. Would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section on our YouTube, on our Substack. And, if we don't do a video before the new year, Happy New Year to everyone, and happy holidays as well. And let us know your thoughts. So, appreciate the time, and we'll see you next time.